Well, now that we're all done taping, I'm going to tack this off.
Okay. What do you mean by tack it off?
Well, what I've got here is what they call a tack cloth. And it's a cloth with a sticky substance on it used to take off any dust that's left over.
Okay. Another measure to ensure we got a clean surface for priming and painting.
Yes.
Okay.
And now we're going to prime.
All right. Shake the can. How long are you supposed to shake a can like that?
Well, the directions say that you should shake it a minute after the steel ball starts to rattle. But because primer surfacer is heavy product, it wouldn't hurt to shake it for a couple minutes or maybe even 3 minutes.
Okay. Is there anything special about the primer that we're going to use here?
This is a primer surfacer, a sandable primer.
Okay, which is important for in between coats so we can sand it and make the surface good and smooth.
And we're using it as a filler.
Okay, all right. Now, you told me also about a test panel. I've got one here. Show us how we're supposed to use this and why it's used.
We want to shoot out a test panel so that we can assure ourselves that the nozzle is working properly.
Okay.
And that we have the right product.
All right.
And it looks good.
Looks like it's working well. All right. Next thing that I want to make sure that everybody knows is when priming or painting any surfaces, you want to make sure you use one of these. It's a dust respirator. It keeps the fumes and dust and stuff from painting out of your lungs and out of your nose. What Randy will be using is actually a professional one that they use in the body shop. Okay, let's go ahead and start priming. Now, whenever using spray primer, make sure you're holding the can about 12 to 16 inches away from the surface being primed. And don't cover with a continuous spray, but release the button every once in a while and overlap your strokes. And remember, light coats are better than heavy coats.
Once your first coat of primer has set up tacky, but appears dry, apply the second coat. Several thin coats are best to help fill any small sanding scratches or imperfections and to build up the thickness of the primer for final sanding. Again, when the second coat is tacky but appears dry, apply the third and final coat of primer. Additional coats may be needed, but most often 3 coats will be sufficient.
Okay, we've got the surface all primed now. Randy's beginning to sand the surface. Is there anything special that we should remember about sanding at this point in time?
Well, we're using the same procedure as we did before when we were prepping the panel.
Okay.
Basically sand back and forth in a straight, even pattern.
All right. I noticed you're using the sponge method as earlier.
Yeah, we're using that again so that we don't leave any finger marks or we're digging grooves into the primer with our fingers. So we're using the pad in between to help absorb that.
Okay, how about the grit of our sandpaper? What grit are we using now?
320 grit again, same thing as we started out with. Works very well for painting over.
Okay. Now I could do this wet or dry?
Either way, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Of course, wet, you want to use the wet or dry paper.
Right.
And dry seems to work a little bit better with the open coat paper, but you can also do that with the wet or dry paper also, using it dry.
Okay. Okay, looks like we're getting there.
Yeah, we're just about done here. This looks pretty good.
Okay.
Feels pretty good to me. How about you, Scott?
Yeah, it's nice and smooth. Now, how come it is that we're always feeling the paint instead of just looking at our surface and saying, yeah, it looks good?
Well, we want to, in bodywork, feel everything that you do, because if you can feel an imperfection, you'll probably be able to see it through the paint.
Okay, so you're sometimes basically saying an imperfection I can feel, I might not be able to see.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Why don't you step back just a minute and I'll blow this off.
All right.
Okay, now I want to tack it again.
Okay.
And then we're ready for paint.
Here's the tack cloth.
And again, we're just taking off the residual sand, primer sand,
Dust. Okay.
And we're ready for paint.
Okay, we've got our surface all prepared, and it's ready to paint. But before we start painting, make sure you spray a test panel like we did here. There's a couple of reasons for that. For one, you can check to make sure that your paint is mixed up well and that it comes out of the nozzle all right. And secondly, you can actually match it up to the side of your vehicle to make sure you've got the right paint to match the vehicle. Okay, I think we're about ready to go, right?
Yep.
All right, I'm going to put my mask on, and we'll start painting. Now, while you're painting, make sure you hold the can about 6 to 10 inches from the surface. Press the spray button all the way down and paint in several steady, even strokes. To avoid runs and sags, don't apply heavy coats. Spray light but wet coats and allow the paint to become tacky in between coats.
Just as we demonstrated during priming, you'll get the best results by applying several thin coats of paint. Here, we're applying the second coat. After the second coat is tacky, yet not totally dry, we'll apply the third coat. Remember to use smooth, even strokes when painting. In our case, we chose to apply a fourth coat of paint as our final coat. Again, the number of coats of paint will vary with your specific repair.
Let's review how to repair peeling paint. First, wash the area thoroughly and allow to dry. Use a wax and grease remover and clean the area. Next, lightly sand the damaged area. After sanding, wipe the area using a clean towel. Again, apply wax and grease remover to the sanded area. Mask off the area to be repaired. Using a tack cloth, clean the area thoroughly. Next, apply a sanding primer using several light coats. Once dry, lightly sand the area. Once again, wipe the area clean using your tack cloth. Paint the damaged area in several light coats.
The items you will need to color sand and buff your vehicle's paint include a bucket full of water, a sponge and clean soft towels, some masking tape, 1,000 to 2,000 grit sandpaper, coarse and fine rubbing compounds and final glaze, a drill and 2 buffing pads or a machine buffer, safety glasses or goggles, and a good wax.
Okay, we've finished our final coats of paint, and we've allowed the paint to dry for a couple days before final finishing. Randy, what's our first step here now?
Well, Scott, what we'd like to do is take and color sand and rub out this area that we've blended into to make the texture as smooth as the original finish.
Okay, yeah, I noticed a little bit of roughness in our new paint, so we're going to match that to the old stuff now.
Correct, and I've taken some masking tape again to mask off the moldings and this stripe up here to protect them so that we don't either sand on them or buff on them.
Okay, now you've got a little sanding block there, again, a sponge. Tell us again why you're using that.
Well, I'm using a sponge again so that we don't get finger marks as we're sanding.
All right, and what grit of sandpaper will you be using?
And we're using a 2,000 grit sandpaper.
Okay, very, very fine sandpaper, so very minimal scratches as you're sanding.
Correct.
I notice you're also wet sanding then.
We want to use a lot of water here as we're wet sanding.
And what does the water do then?
Cleans out the grit of the paper, and it also gives us a nice, smooth sanding surface.
Okay.
That's starting to look pretty